Hi, I'm Cheryl Brunette, and today we're going to take a look at stranded knitting. What exactly is it? I'm going to give you a good introduction. Stranded knitting is a color technique usually worked with only two colors at a time, both of which are carried all the way across a row or round of knitting. When one color is being knit, the other color is held to the wrong side or non-public side of the work, and it forms this little strand. Where is it? I worked these in pretty well, but there's a little strand behind there. You can see them. And that's behind the other color. So when you look at a piece of knitting from the front, and if you see that the colors go all the way across, you can identify it right away as stranded, as opposed to intarsia. So here we go. Here's an old cave facet design that I did many years ago. And these colors do not go all the way across. These are in blocks of colors. And these blocks can be representational, like a sailboat or a blocky uppercase M for the University of Michigan. I'm just plugging my alma mater there. Or they can be geometric, like these, like this tumbling blocks. This is actually a very easy old quilt pattern, a simple one to do. So every time you change color, you have to cross the yarns and you twist them around one another. Not quite, well, you do. You kind of hook them like that. Otherwise, if you didn't do that, you'd have two separate pieces of knitting. And very occasionally, let me reach over here, you get a combination of both stranded and intarsia. This was my son's sweater when he was 5 years old. I made this for him. And obviously I didn't let him wear it a whole bunch. But this is another cave facet design. And it has both intarsia. Here, see this blue, and then this red, and then this pink. They don't go all the way across, nor do these. But right here, I am stranding between this brown. The brown goes all the way across, and then I introduce and I'm stranding this. So this is a little bit like patting your tummy and rubbing your head at the same time, because I was doing intarsia here and stranding, and you can see the strands. I had to twist it when I changed colors right there, but I did strand that all the way across. And I did strand the brown behind the pink and behind the blue here. Fair Isle is a term that some people use interchangeably with stranded knitting, but technically it's just one type of stranded knitting. Fair Isle is an actual small island in the north of Scotland. It's part of the Shetland Islands, and Fair Isle knitting is recognizable by its patterns. They are horizontal bands of varying width. I'm going to try to keep this glare. Sorry about that. This is, well, here, let me give you a better example. This is a typical one. You can see that there's a wider band and then a narrower band. And that's pretty stylistic of them. Let me show you this one. This sweater was made in 1925. This one was a more recent sweater. This is, I think, a 1986 sweater. And this has the dark background. But again, you can see that there are wide bands and narrow bands. It's a little more difficult to see. And you can also see, typically they only use 6 to 8 colors, but by varying the colors as they go across, and they only use 2 colors at a time, it can look much more complex than it actually is to work, because you're only working with 2 at a time. And it's typically worked in the round for Shetland, and this is a pullover, but even if you were going to do a cardigan, you would work it in the round and you would do what's called a steek in the front to open it up. There are a couple of kinds of steeks. What you do is you're adding extra yarn there. So here's a wound steek. I never do this. This is one way to do it, where you wind extra yarn around the needles when you get there. And then when it's time to, and so you just keep going, around and around. And when it's time to cut up the front of your cardigan, you cut it this way. But I never do it this way because I don't want to work in all of those ends, right? There is also somewhere around here the kind of steek that I use, which is just, here it is, just the very next page. That I do this. This is adding extra stitches. You cast on the stitches at the bottom, for example, for a square neck hole, and you work them across. This is every other stitch is another color. So when you're done with this, 1, 2, 3, 4, you cut up between those two stitches. Now that kind of horrifies people, but you can see it gives you a nice facing that you can, it's going to turn to that other side. Usually these are made with a fairly grabby wool, and it eventually mats together. It's also fairly fine, so there's very little danger of it unraveling. And even if you were to use a silk or a rayon, which is a very silky, unravelly kind of, that would be more likely to unravel. But even that, the fabric does not want to unravel when you cut it in this direction. When you cut it in this direction, yes, watch out. But when you cut it in that direction, it's easier. And why is it done that way? Because when you're working circularly, you can always see the pattern in front of you, which is a true advantage. But the Fair Islanders aren't the only ones who do this kind of knitting. Earlier, that blue and white sweater that I showed you was a Cowichan, which is a British Columbia design. This one is another more recent sweater for my son. This is Icelandic, and those are made typically with yokes. Again, circularly, all the way. These are made from the bottom up rather than the top down. And stranded in the back. See those strands? They are pretty intact. And Latvian mittens are stranded. Look at these beautiful designs. Look at how fine that yarn is. Also, there are lots of Scandinavian designs. There are Norwegian. These are some Swedish sweaters. Look at this one. This is a very old one. This was knitted in 1858. It has the date right across there. And it was a man's sweater. So notice that stranding mostly evolved in cold climates because it's a very warm kind of knit because it has its two layers. You have stockinette in the front and the strands in the back. This sweater is at least 30 years old. I've slept in it while camping. I've repaired the cuffs several times. You can see not only do they need repair again, I think I'm at the point where I'm going to cut them off and re-knit them. This was Manos del Uruguay, and many years ago, it's the standard stuff. I ordered a whole bunch of it. All of it is Manos, and I love this yarn. And in fact, it doesn't have any fuzz left. It's all been worn off. But because it's a thick thin, and the color that I used for the cuffs was fairly thin, I think I'm going to find a more robust ball of this yarn, that like this one, that will hold a little bit better for that. And this was, I had a lot of fun making it. This was the first sweater that I made from Elizabeth Zimmerman's percentage system, and it was my first large stranding project where I used two hands for two colors. However, I designed it on the fly because I pulled yarns out of this big basket of them that I had gathered, and I was pulling patterns out of my head at the same time. And that required a lot of decision making as I knit. Add that to the new skills of two-fisted two-color knitting, and I couldn't focus on all those things at once. So I did not do a great job of dealing with the strands. Actually, worse than that. I did a terrible job of dealing with the strands. Notice I left them really long and relaxed because that was my primary goal. That was the skill I was working on, was to make sure that this didn't pucker at all. And look at, in some places I even used three colors. Not very often, but in this row, these two rows, I used three colors, which is not my favorite thing to do, by the way. But these were caught, these have been caught on buttons. And so they're pretty tacky on the inside. And then I put a little bit of a metallic in there, and that pulled out. So this sweater is still really serviceable. I mean, for around the place, around the farm, and I still love it, but I got more skilled on my next stranded, two-fisted, two-stranded sweater in terms of working in the yarn ends, or working in the floats. This is another Kaffe facet design, and it is called Jack's Back. Now this is something I would never attempt to do back and forth, because this is a very complex pattern. Here's this, you see this thing going up and down, and I did not choose these colors. These are all Kaffe facets. And I bought a kit that had all these in it. It really was a beautiful thing to do. This is where I remember I talked about steeking. When I got to here, I took some stitches off the needle and put them on a holder, and then I cast on, I don't know how many stitches it was. I think it was about I think it was 6 or 8, might have been 7, and sometimes I cut up in the middle of it. You can see there's the when I turned it to the inside and cut it, and I covered it with that little bit of seam binding, that lace stretchable seam binding, and I sewed that down by hand. So this one, though, I wanted to make sure I did a better job of tidying the strands on the inside, and you can see that I caught the yarns every other stitch, so that this makes a really dense and warm. This is a very warm fabric. I also, this was a design from the 80s, and his designs were great. They were these huge rectangles of color, and but huge was the operative term. So I cut this down considerably. I cut one of these out, a whole one of those patterns, maybe even 2 of those patterns. And here's the square. It was a square set armhole, so it was really easy to do. And also this was not what the pattern called for. I put this in. It was a crew neck sweater, and I wanted a nice little shawl collar. So you can see that I learned some stuff. I also steek these armholes, by the way. Let me look, and let's just pull that open, shall we? To see what that looks like. Again, here was my steek, and I just folded it back, and in this case, I sewed it in. I sewed this seam because I wanted the integrity of the pattern to come up and match the integrity on the bottom. Sometimes when you have a steeking like this, you can just pick up the seam, or this, and pick up your sleeves and knit them down, and you don't have a seam at all. But in this case, I couldn't do that. That's it. Your introduction to stranded knitting. And on the next program of this series, I'll show you how to read a simple chart, how to work stranded knitting from the public or right side, the knit side, using 2 hands, 1 color in each hand, how to catch or trap or weave in the strands like this, so that you know how to do this from the knit side. And there's even a bonus skill you'll learn, and that's how to make what Meg Swanson calls a speed swatch, which is actually a flat piece, but it's a circular swatch. Until then, enjoy your knitting. And my hair looks okay. I'm a little bit washed out, but that's okay. We don't care about this wire. Well, I never know. I'm supposed to go. Hi.